The 13th century monastery stands in historical memory as a site of profound devotion, yet behind the stone walls of the abbey lay a reality of psychological and physical endurance that few in the modern world could fathom. It was an environment designed not for comfort, but for the total transformation of the individual into an instrument of divine worship. Guided by the rule of St. Benedict, monastic life was a relentless cycle of discipline, deprivation, and labor that sought to dissolve the human ego into a collective, sanctified routine. To understand this life is to look past the romanticized stillness of ruins and into the grueling, visceral experience of the men who inhabited them. The tyranny of the bell. Life in a 13th century abbey was dictated by a rhythm that ignored the natural human desire for rest. The day began not with the sun, but in the depths of the night at 2:00 a.m., prompted by the sharp, piercing toll of the abbey bell. This sound was a command that allowed for no hesitation. For the brothers, the transition from sleep to the frozen stone of the church was immediate. 8 times throughout the day and night, the bells rang for the divine office, or hoary, effectively chopping the day into merciless, unyielding segments. These services, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, ensured that no monk could ever achieve a state of true solitude or extended mental rest. The night office of matins was perhaps the most grueling. Monks would rise from their straw-filled pallets, walk through pitch-black, freezing corridors, and stand motionless in an unheated stone cathedral for hours. In the winter months, when the temperature inside the church frequently dropped below freezing, the cold was not merely a discomfort, it was a physical assault. It was common to see water frozen solid in the chalices, and the breath of the assembled monks hung in the air like thick, ghostly steam. Any movement to combat the biting cold was seen as a defiance of monastic discipline. The communal dormitory, a test of endurance. The concept of privacy was non-existent in the medieval monastery. 40 men resided in a single, unheated dormitory under the roof, where windows were often nothing more than shuttered holes, allowing the winter wind to whistle through the rafters. Sleep, such as it was, occurred on primitive wooden platforms or straw-filled mattresses. These mattresses, rarely changed and teeming with fleas, lice, and bedbugs, turned every attempt at rest into a battle against itching and infestation. The rules of the order often forbade the removal of clothing before sleep. The monks wore their coarse woolen habits, damp with the sweat and grime of the previous day's labor, and kept their leather shoes on to be ready for the immediate summons of the night bell. The dormitory was a sensory nightmare. The smell of 40 unwashed bodies in a stifling, poorly ventilated space was overpowering. The abbot or an overseer patrolled the aisles throughout the night, ensuring that no monk sought comfort in forbidden positions or engaged in behaviors deemed improper. This constant surveillance meant that even in the deepest stages of exhaustion, a monk could never truly relax, as the gaze of the monastic system followed him into his very dreams. The vow of silence. Perhaps the most potent tool for suppressing the individual spirit was the strict vow of silence. Idle conversation was forbidden anywhere on the abbey grounds. The human voice was reserved strictly for prayer or communal reading. This silence was not a peaceful void, it was a palpable, heavy weight. To conduct the essential business of the abbey, the brothers developed an intricate language of hundreds of gestures. Rubbing the chin might signal a request for cheese, while crossed fingers requested a book. This reliance on sign language over years of isolation fundamentally altered the monks' perception of the world. Their hearing became hypersensitive, picking up the slightest rustle of fabric or the scrape of a foot on stone. Social connections withered. Men who lived side by side for decades often knew nothing of each other's personal histories or families. They were well-oiled parts of a machine, functioning in proximity but remaining complete strangers. When a monk was forced to break this silence, for instance, during a confession, the experience was often jarring, as they had largely forgotten the cadence and function of their own voices. Diet and physical decay. Food in the monastery was sustenance, not pleasure. It was a fuel source designed to keep the vessel of the body alive while ensuring it remained weak enough to avoid carnal distraction. The diet consisted primarily of coarse black bread, often ground with grit from millstones that wore down teeth, and thick, bland porridge made of oats, barley, or beans. From September until Easter, the fast was particularly brutal, with only one meal served per day. Monks frequently spent their days in hard labor, ploughing fields or working in workshops on entirely empty stomachs. The primary source of calories was weak, thick monastic ale, which provided essential nutrients that solid food lacked. Vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Scurvy, which caused gums to bleed and teeth to fall out by age 30, was common. Because of the near-total lack of protein and the physical toll of the labor, the bodies of these men withered prematurely. A 30-year-old monk in the 13th century often possessed the physical frailty of a man twice his age, with chronic back pain, joint stiffness, and digestive issues becoming his permanent companions. The scriptorium, a hell of precision. The production of manuscripts was the intellectual cornerstone of the monastery, but the asterisk scriptorium where this work occurred was a place of immense physical suffering. It was typically a cold, drafty gallery with high windows. In winter, ink would freeze solid, and fingers would swell and blue from the cold. Scribes sat for hours on backless, hard wooden stools, hunched over slanted desks in positions that inevitably led to severe spinal deformation and rib cage distortion. The work required absolute, trembling concentration. A single error on a piece of expensive, laboriously prepared parchment could lead to days of penance. Beyond the physical strain, the work was toxic. Inks made from oak galls and iron sulfate, and paints containing lead, arsenic, and cinnabar were handled without protection. Scribes, who often held their brushes close to their faces, inhaled toxic dust for years, leading to heavy metal poisoning. By age 40, many were blind or suffered from such severe scribe's cramp that their hands were permanently clawed. This physical deterioration was interpreted as a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of the divine word. Mortification and the cult of suffering. For the most devout, the body was an adversary to be conquered. Voluntary self-flagellation and the wearing of hair shirts, garments made of coarse, prickly goat hair, were commonplace. These shirts rubbed the skin raw, creating bloody blisters that were left to fester, serving as a constant physical reminder of spiritual focus. During Lent, monks would lash themselves with knotted ropes in the darkness of the church, sometimes adding glass shards or hooks to the ends of the whips to ensure the agony reached a state of religious ecstasy. This culture of self-mutilation created a competitive environment where young novices vied to outdo one another in ascetic severity. The abbot generally ignored these practices, seeing them as evidence of profound piety. This systemic encouragement of pain, coupled with a lack of medical knowledge, where bloodletting was the primary remedy for all maladies, meant that the monastery was a place where the immune system was under constant siege. The Black Death and the collapse of a system. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, it struck the monasteries with unparalleled ferocity. Their communal architecture, the shared sleeping quarters, the communal eating halls, and the constant close contact made them death chambers. A single flea brought into a dormitory was a death sentence for dozens. The plague shattered the medieval worldview. The monks, who had dedicated their lives to the mortification of the flesh and the constant, rhythmic praise of God, found themselves dying in agonizing, humiliating ways. The infirmaries were quickly overwhelmed, with the sick left to moan and expire in the hallways. As the death toll rose, the living were forced to abandon the most basic rituals, dumping bodies into massive, shallow pits. The aftermath of the plague forever altered the psychological landscape of the survivors. If a life of total sacrifice and strict adherence to the rule did not protect them from such a horrific fate, the fundamental logic of their existence was called into question. The silence of the abandoned scriptoria and the encroaching weeds in the fields marked the end of an era of absolute monastic dominance. Many who survived lost their fear of the divine order, casting off their robes to return to a world that was rapidly changing. The legacy of the abbey. Ultimately, the 13th-century monastery was a machine built for the erasure of the individual. It was a structure that turned human suffering into a form of abstract piety. The beautiful cathedrals and intricate, gold-leafed manuscripts that remain in our museums today were purchased at a terrible cost in human health, sanity, and dignity. To look at these remnants today is to see the artifacts of a system that viewed humanity as a disposable tool. The history of the monastery is not merely a history of religion or art. It is a history of the endurance of the human spirit under conditions of systematic oppression. The river of tears that watered these cloisters serves as a grim reminder of how far individuals were once expected to go in the name of a higher calling, a reminder that stands in stark contrast to the romanticized silence of modern monastic ruins. The reality was not peace, but a lifelong, grinding conflict between the soul and the weary, aching flesh.